She stood in the doorway like she hadn't spent years hollowing out the man now stepping away from her. Her arms crossed, chin tilted just enough to feign dignity without admitting fault. "You've changed," she said, her voice too calm for someone who just watched her life fold in half. I paused just long enough to look at her, not to argue, not to explain. Just to make sure she understood the weight of her own words. That was the goal. I stepped past her with the travel bag already in my hand. My keys didn't jingle. The silence between us wasn't new, it had just finally been named. She didn't follow. That surprised me more than anything. 3 years ago, she would have tried to salvage the moment with a well-timed tear, a carefully whispered, "Don't leave like this." 2 years ago, she might have thrown something, a cup, an accusation, a plea masked as anger. Even last year, she would have waited until my hand was on the door before saying something sharp enough to wound, just to stay in control. Now she stood there like a woman still trying to decide which version of herself to perform. I didn't look back, but as I reached the car, I saw her reflection in the rear window, still in the doorway, still waiting for someone to react the way she'd scripted. The problem was, I'd stopped reading her lines months ago. I sat behind the wheel, engine humming low, the bag on the passenger seat barely zipped. It wasn't packed in a rush. I'd been building toward this day one decision at a time. Quieter mornings, fewer shared plans, password changes, and polite silences. Somewhere in the quiet, I'd stopped explaining myself to someone who only ever listened with conditions. She wasn't crying. That would have meant she still had access to something real between us. But there was only confusion on her face, like I'd walked off a stage mid-scene and left her holding a script with no co-star. I pulled away slowly, deliberately. There would be no argument. No dramatic scene in the driveway. Just the clean break of a man who had finally outgrown the shape he had contorted himself into for someone else's comfort. And as the house faded in the rearview, I let the stillness settle over me, the kind of stillness that isn't quiet, but earned. She hadn't needed to raise her voice to reshape me. It was always subtler than that. Pauses long enough to signal disappointment, compliments sharpened with qualifiers, touches withheld until I'd earned them back. At first, I mistook it for standards. Now I saw it for what it was, calibration. She'd spent years sanding down the edges of me she couldn't predict. "Don't take it the wrong way," she used to say, which was code for, "Take it exactly the way I want, or things would shift." At first, I played along. You don't notice the trade-offs when they're tiny. The shirt you stop wearing because she doesn't like the color, the silence you keep during dinner because she just needs you to listen tonight. 1,000 little exchanges that, over time, amount to surrender. She praised me when I mirrored her moods, when I echoed her insecurities back in soothing tones, and when I dared to have my own perspective, when I questioned a conclusion or challenged a version of the truth she'd already rehearsed. She called it resistance. "You're so defensive lately," she'd say, hand on her hip like she was worried for me, not about me. The shift wasn't sudden. It was atmospheric. A slow suffocation under the guise of intimacy. When I stopped bending, she called it arrogance. The more I healed, the more she framed it as distance. It didn't occur to her that maybe I hadn't pulled away, maybe I had just stood up. By the time I found clarity, I no longer needed a fight. I'd already stopped asking for her to see me. I was observing now, not engaging, taking note of her patterns, not reacting to them. That silence? That was the sound of someone finally done performing. One evening, she dropped her fork mid-dinner and said, "I miss when you used to laugh more." I looked up at her calm. "I used to laugh at everything." "That wasn't the same as being happy." She didn't respond. She just blinked, then changed the subject. It was the first time I realized how little she wanted the real version of me. She loved the one who bent, the one who tried. Now that I wasn't bending, she didn't know what to do with me. So she told herself a story where I'd changed for the worse. And maybe I had changed, but it was the kind of change you make when you finally understand you were being shaped into someone small, just to make someone else feel big. The applause always faded when the growth wasn't hers. That was the pattern I kept circling back to. The nights I came home sharper, more grounded, speaking with clarity instead of apology, those were the nights she became distant. Like she couldn't hear me unless I spoke in self-doubt. When I started sleeping better, waking earlier, working later, when I stopped volunteering every thought just to fill the silence, she called it emotional withdrawal. "I just don't feel seen anymore," she said one morning, standing in the kitchen, arms folded like I owed her something. I watched the steam rise from my mug and gave her a long look. "I'm right here," I said, and I meant it. But she didn't want me there. She wanted the version who needed her praise to feel whole, the version who shared every thought with his eyes already seeking her approval. What she missed wasn't presence, it was the feeling of directing everything. That realization came slow, the way fog lifts, not all at once, but enough to see the outlines of what you're actually living in. I'd thought we were growing. What we were doing was maintaining a system, and the system worked best when I stayed confused. I still remember the first time I didn't defend myself. She made a passive remark about how I used to be more open, that I didn't talk about my feelings anymore. She said it with a soft tone and tilted head, calculated concern. Instead of explaining, I just nodded. Not sarcastic. Just done. She didn't know what to do with that. Her affection had always been performance-based, and now the performance was faltering. I wasn't giving her the old cues anymore. She'd ask how I was doing, and I'd answer honestly but briefly. No dramatic narratives, no emotional currency handed over to be cashed in later. Just facts. She called that cold. I called it boundaries. And while she spun stories to friends about how I'd become someone else, how I'd lost my warmth, she never mentioned the moments that led up to it. The years of small corrections, subtle criticisms, the way love always had a receipt. She had rehearsed those stories so many times, she started to believe them. That I was drifting. That therapy had changed me too much. That self-respect was somehow the opposite of love. But I was still right there. Still making coffee. Still sharing space. I just wasn't asking her who I was supposed to be anymore. The first time I heard her rehearse the breakup, she wasn't even talking to me. I was walking past the home office. She was on a video call, her voice hushed but deliberate, that careful pitch she used when she wanted to sound thoughtful without sounding guilty. "Maybe he's just not my person long term," she said, tapping her fingers on the desk like she wasn't deciding anything yet, just exploring. "He's different now. Harder to connect with." The call ended before I could hear the reply, but I already knew how it went. Her friend would have offered a soft, encouraging echo, told her how brave she was for being honest, maybe even said what she wanted to hear. You deserve to feel seen. What struck me most wasn't the content. I'd expected that part. It was the delivery. Polished. Scripted. Like she'd said it before. That night, she posted a picture from our anniversary dinner a month earlier. Captioned it. "Growth isn't always visible, but it matters." I remember staring at it, remembering how quiet we'd been during that meal, how she'd barely looked up from her phone. I wasn't even sure she liked the food. But now it was a story. A curated version. One where she was thoughtful and evolving, and I was fading into the background, a shadow she could outgrow. She started seeding these lines into conversation more often. Not with me, with others, within earshot, or just loud enough to register. You can love someone and still outgrow them. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is realizing your partner isn't doing the same work. I just don't recognize him anymore. All floated like passive observations, but each one was part of a campaign. She hadn't ended it yet, but she wanted to shape the narrative when she did. Her version would be thoughtful, noble, sad but necessary. So I let her keep pretending. I went to work. I came home. I did the dishes. I responded kindly when she floated emotional bait. I stayed calm when she probed for reactions. It was theater now, and I had stopped auditioning. She thought I was retreating. But what I was really doing was listening, taking notes, letting her reveal the way she needed this to end, with me looking like the one who drifted away, so she could claim the role of the one who tried. She never imagined I was writing a version 2, one that didn't need a spotlight. Just the truth. It was a Tuesday evening when I found the file. I wasn't looking for it, just transferring documents off the shared laptop before resetting it. We'd agreed to separate accounts months earlier, part of a space conversation she initiated after her second solo trip. To clear her head, I didn't ask questions. I just started quietly preparing. The folder was labeled with my name. At first, I thought it was financial, old receipts, maybe a budget sheet. But when I opened it, I saw the title sitting at the top of the document like it was waiting for me. Why We Grew Apart, Notes. It wasn't a journal. It was a rehearsal. Bullet points, half-drafted captions, quotes about evolving love, pulled from articles and podcasts. Not a single sentence addressed to me, all framed like she was speaking to an audience. Because she was. I scrolled slowly, reading each line like a map of revisionist history. Therapy changed him too much. He used to listen more. Hard to love someone who thinks they're healed. We just want different things now. I want connection, he wants control? That last one made me pause. Control. The irony was surgical. She hadn't lost me because I changed. She'd lost access to the version of me who kept asking her for permission to exist. When that stopped, she needed a story to explain the shift, one where she was the thoughtful one, the evolving one, and I was the one who couldn't keep up. But what she couldn't script was what I would do with the truth. I didn't print the file immediately. I just stared at it, my mind slow and steady, no panic. There was no betrayal in it, not the kind you can hold up to someone's face and demand justice for. Just a quiet, calculated deception. She wasn't preparing to break up with me. She was preparing to frame the breakup, to steer the meaning of what came next. And in that moment I decided, she wouldn't get to be the only author of the ending. I backed up the file. Not for leverage. I wasn't planning to discredit her, or plead my case to friends, or build a counter-narrative. I just wanted the facts to survive. She'd been building her version of the ending. Now I would write mine. The envelope didn't need a letter. That was the point. I placed it on the kitchen counter just before dawn. Same place she used to leave the passive notes about groceries or unread mail, or the small things I'd forgotten. This one wasn't passive. It was final. Inside, a signed lease transfer, notice of joint account closures, my new mailing address, and a printed copy of her "Why We Grew Apart" notes. I didn't annotate it. I didn't need to. There was no confrontation, no speech, no explosion, just the soft weight of paper carrying the truths she thought I'd never find. I stood there for a moment, not with hesitation but recognition. It was the last time I'd be in that space, not just physically, but as the man who once believed her approval was evidence of love. She came into the hallway seconds after I opened the door. Not rush, not dramatic, just slightly breathless, like she'd sensed the shift before she saw it. "Wait. What?" Her voice cracked slightly, not from emotion but miscalculation. She hadn't rehearsed this part. I looked at her calmly, the same way you look at someone who's tried to sell you a version of yourself you've outgrown. She opened her mouth again, fingers twitching like she wanted to reach for something, me, the envelope, an excuse. But I stepped outside before she could finish whatever sentence she was about to begin. No fury. No farewell. Just a clean silence, heavy with everything I didn't need to explain anymore. The door clicked behind me like punctuation. Not a slam. Just closure. I knew she'd open the envelope immediately. She'd see the paperwork first. Logical, clinical, irreversible. Then she'd see the draft. And she'd know. I'd read it all. I hadn't copied it to use against her. I hadn't mentioned it in text or left clues to bait a reaction. I'd simply read it, understood it, and acted. The final look she gave me as I walked down the steps, it wasn't anger. It was disorientation. Like the scene had flipped, and she no longer knew her role. She had spent so long preparing to be the one who left thoughtfully. Now she was the one left, unprepared, uncast, unscripted. And I didn't look back, not to hurt her, but because I didn't need her to see me leave. I just needed her to know I was already gone. She started calling people within the hour. I knew she would. Control doesn't vanish quietly. It scrambles for witnesses. The first call, she used her "This is hard for me" voice. I could picture the slight tremble, the sigh just before she spoke, as if the pain were fresh instead of orchestrated. But the problem with rehearsals is that you repeat them. And some of her friends had already heard versions of her speech before she ever read my silence. Only one picked up. The rest let it ring. She tried again. This time louder, not her voice, but her narrative. Group messages, subtle status posts, all crafted to suggest ambiguity. Sometimes love changes and you don't notice until it's too late. Wishing people healing, even when they choose distance. But the friend who did answer, her expression must have said enough. Because I knew she'd seen the draft. I had left one unspoken breadcrumb. I didn't email it. I didn't print extra copies. I didn't make threats. But I didn't hide it from the friend who once told me over drinks, half apologetically, "You deserve to be loved without managing someone else's story." That friend saw the envelope too. Saw her file. Saw what she had saved under my name, assuming I'd never look, because she still thought I was the version of me who didn't. "You don't get to rewrite this one," the friend said. "I wasn't there. but I could imagine the words landing like stone on glass. Calm. Unmoved. That's the thing about building your own ending quietly. It gives people time to see both sides before anyone raises their voice. She had counted on sympathy. But sympathy, like trust, doesn't thrive on rehearsed pain. It thrives on truth. Now she was left holding a performance with no audience. The captions rang hollow. The indirect jabs didn't echo. Control doesn't just vanish. It rots when it can't find oxygen. For the first time in our shared history, she wasn't driving the story. She was watching it walk away from her, without noise, without apology. Just finality. I didn't go silent to punish her. I went silent because there was nothing left to say that she hadn't already rehearsed a response for. The silence had been growing between us long before I walked out. It just hadn't been acknowledged. She'd been speaking into it for months, testing if she still had pull. Each time I didn't rise to the bait, she mistook it for distance. But it wasn't distance. It was clarity. I no longer needed to be heard by someone who only listened for angles. The shift was internal long before it became visible. At first, it was small. I stopped over-explaining myself. I stopped narrating my moods for her comfort. I stopped apologizing for moments of stillness she couldn't interpret. Then came the bigger moves. Separate passwords, solo errands, my name quietly taken off shared subscriptions. She didn't ask why. She just assumed I was checked out. That's how she framed it in passing, as if detachment had happened to me. But detachment didn't happen to me. It was earned through repetition, through the erosion of real conversation under a constant fog of commentary. One night, weeks before I left, we sat on the couch, TV murmuring in the background. She looked over and said, "You don't tell me how you're feeling anymore." I remember shifting in my seat, looking at her fully, and answering without hesitation. "I don't feel safe doing that here anymore." She blinked, not defensive, confused, like the sentence didn't fit the script. I said nothing else. Let the silence answer for me. That was the difference between withdrawal and recovery. She saw silence as absence. I had come to see it as peace. It no longer needed to be filled with validation or repaired with compromise. Now that silence had expanded, not just in the apartment I'd left behind, but in every space she tried to re-enter. My phone didn't ring. My inbox stayed clear. Because I hadn't disappeared, I had simply stopped explaining my presence. She wasn't the first person to speak into a void and expect an echo. But this time, there was nothing. And that nothing spoke louder than any version of the truth she could craft. She opened the envelope again an hour later. Not because she hadn't read it, she had. She'd probably scrolled through every document 3 times, checking for clues, for meaning, for something she could argue against. But it was all logistics. Facts, signed and dated and finished. What she hadn't seen, or hadn't processed, was the line I'd written at the very bottom of her draft. Just 7 words, in my handwriting, beneath her closing bullet point like a quiet mirror she couldn't avoid. "You changed too. You just thought no one would notice." That line wasn't meant as an accusation. It was a correction. She had built her narrative carefully, positioning my growth as the problem, painting healing as ego, boundaries as cruelty. But what she hadn't accounted for was her own transformation. She didn't break us with a single decision. She drifted us there. One curated post, one avoided truth, one more subtle move toward becoming someone whose image mattered more than our actual life. Her change was harder to detect because it wore the mask of self-care. But real self-care doesn't require someone else to shrink. Real growth doesn't need a scapegoat. She used to touch my hand in restaurants, used to text me poems when I worked late, used to reach for me when she was tired, not just when she was lonely. Then came the edits. "I need someone more emotionally available. You're not as ambitious as you used to be. I can't carry both of us." Except I wasn't asking to be carried. I was asking to be met. And the truth is, I noticed every shift. I just stayed quiet longer than I should have. Not out of fear. Out of hope. The kind of hope that makes you think maybe this is just a phase. That maybe the person you built a life with will remember how to meet you in the middle. But she didn't. Because she wasn't building a middle anymore. She was building an exit. My sentence at the bottom of her draft wasn't revenge. It was the final confirmation. She didn't want to be seen for what she'd become. She just didn't think I'd look. The podcast offer she kept hinting at, the one she'd been nurturing through cryptic posts and carefully posed selfies, disappeared within days. She didn't get a formal rejection. They just stopped replying. The brand deals she teased in stories, the one that required her to maintain a certain healing arc, quietly lost interest too. She hadn't posted the envelope, hadn't shared the documents, hadn't said anything publicly about the split. But people noticed. There's a silence that follows a performance breaking down. It doesn't roar. It recedes, one viewer at a time, one like, one unread message. Her version of the story had counted on being the first one told. She never considered that the absence of my voice would speak louder than any caption. She had rehearsed vulnerability, monetized perspective, curated the kind of transparency that only showed you what she'd already pre-approved. But you can't build a platform on partial truths without someone eventually noticing the seams. And now, without the narrative she had counted on, there was nothing to market. No journey to package. No empowered goodbye she could brand. Just unraveling, slow, quiet, and irreversible. People unfollowed without comment. Collaborators distanced without confrontation. She wasn't cancelled. She was just no longer compelling. She had built an audience on the illusion of insight. But when real life knocked, silent, steady, unsponsored, she couldn't translate it into content. And somewhere in that silence, she started to understand. This wasn't about who left whom. It was about who had stopped pretending first. And the truth, as inconvenient as it was for her storyline, didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be lived. She'd saved the file under my name. That part stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it shocked me, but because of what it revealed. The sheer confidence that I'd never look. She didn't even bury it. No encrypted folder, no vague title like Journal_Final_Draft 3. Just my name, sitting there like a drawer she assumed I'd never open. That was the most telling thing about her mindset. She wasn't hiding. She didn't think she had to. I was supposed to stay uninvolved, a background character in the breakup she was already storyboarding for strangers. She counted on my silence to give her the narrative she wanted. Calm, unbothered detachment that she could fill with implications. But she underestimated something. Not my anger. Not my pride. My clarity. The file was never going to be a weapon. I didn't need it to prove anything. I just needed to understand what kind of ending she had planned for us. And once I did, everything fell into place. I found it by accident, scrolling for tax receipts. She left it right where I'd see it, if I ever looked. And in a way, I think she wanted me to. Maybe some part of her wanted to be caught, not for the drama, but for the confirmation that I was still paying attention, that I was still invested enough to feel something. But I didn't get angry when I found it. I got certain. She wanted me uninvolved. That's exactly who I became. No dramatics, no confrontation, just action, clean, direct. Because once you see how someone's prepared to write the end of your story without you, there's only one thing left to do. Take back the pen.